How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Lumix Live this week. We've got kind of a fun topic. It's one of the things that I've been working a lot at night with our cameras, and we've wanted to kind of highlight some of the different capabilities that our cameras have, some of the technologies behind what makes filming at night and photographing at night a little bit easier these days than it was years ago with film. So I went out last night, recorded a little bit of a kind of just talking head piece of, things that our Lumix cameras offer you and some tips for those that want to get started into this when you're both in the photo and the video side for filming and photographing at night. Now, it's primarily heavily recorded. The recorded portions very heavily leaning towards the video side. I figured on the photo side, we're going to talk more on the live part of the conversation because we've done a stream about live view composite, which I'll drop in the chat so you can take a look at that side of it. Yeah, there's going to be a recorded portion that we're going to be playing here, but during that, make sure to ask your questions. If you've got questions from last week's stream, I see that I'm going to say Tumai is asking about, can we ask questions about topics from last week? Definitely drop your questions in. They don't have to be just about this week's topic. That's kind of one of the fun things about these streams. So if you're new to Lumix Live, these are weekly broadcasts we do every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on YouTube, to offer you all an opportunity to actually just ask us questions, interact with us, and get answers directly from the brand. And one of the nice side benefits is we have a really awesome community that's very active in the chat. So if you've got questions and I might not be able to answer it, someone in the chat probably is going to be able to have some sort of recommendation or comment about it that may help you on your way. So feel free to just drop any of those questions. I only ask that you tag at Lumix Cameras like a lot of people are doing already. It makes it easier for me to see them. And while we're doing the recorded segment, I'll be answering questions in the chat over text. So before we jump into that, reminding everybody about LUMIX Pro Services. We have Red and Platinum tier here in the United States. Red is free. If you've bought a Lumix camera, make sure to get yourself registered there. Takes a few minutes to just fill out the information online and get you into the LUMIX Pro Service platform. This way, if you need any service or you have any issues, you can go right to that portal instead of the general kind of consumer electronics service portal. Just speeds things up a little bit. If you're someone who really uses your equipment hard and you want to make sure that you've got a good backbone of support behind your equipment, maybe take a look at the Platinum service. That's going to get you 2-day repairs with free next day shipping both ways. You're going to get access to an exclusive hotline if you need to call in and speak to somebody for support and help on certain topics with the cameras. You also get 20% off out of warranty repairs. So if something breaks and it's not a warranted product or a warranted coverage for that damage, you're going to get a discount on the repair for that. You also get a really cool welcome gift, which is a Peak Design slide strap. So take a look at it. If you're in the US, you can use the QR code to go right to LUMIX Pro Services here in the US. If you're joining us from overseas or outside of the United States, you can take a look at the link in the description. That's got the global portal where you can get all the information on what's available in your region. So with that, let's take a look and see about some of the questions that have come in the chat. And we'll answer some of those before we go to the session here. So let's see here. Is 4K 120 FPS 422 10-bit to an external solid state drive possible? I honestly don't know. The 422 and the 10-bit side of it, that's what is going to end up generating more thermals and heat and processor load. So since we don't have the firmware out yet for the GH6, which is going to be supporting USB SSD storage, we just don't have some information there for you. So just unfortunately don't have that information ready for you yet. Let's see here. One of the other questions, is there an update to the GH6 sensor? So I honestly don't have anything to add about that yet. It's something that I've asked about. So until I have more information, it's not really something I can answer on here. Let's see here. What's new with the G95 that's listed as coming soon? Um, I don't know. The G95 there I think there's a the part numbers changing a little bit on it. So some dealers or some sites that have G95, that may just be what the difference is there. From my understanding, there's nothing really majorly new coming in that particular line. So yeah, as we get more information about that, I'll fill everybody else in. So let's see here. Before you start, do you have a chance to look at the changing faces to focus on the G100 and G90? I forgot to mail you. I honestly totally forgot about it. I will take a look. You can either hit me up on email or just tag me over on Reddit, because I believe we've communicated on Reddit before too. So you can do that, and then we can follow up on that separately. D Creative Vision says, can the S5 accept timecode for syncing in post? So the S5 does not receive timecode like the S1H or GH6 does. That system has timecode, and it will generate it and apply it to the footage. One thing you can do is basically set up and say you use your mobile device over Bluetooth, and then you can have it synced to time of day. That's one way around it. But yeah, the S5 doesn't have timecode functionality like an S1H or GH6 does, per se. So, and then let's see here. Tumai says, a question from last week, how many people are involved in creating LUMIX Live? Just curious, and Sean used we an hour a bunch of times, even in the title. Yeah, so primarily it's myself, it's me. I usually work on coming up with the ideas, going through the chat, working on it. But we have a support team from our marketing team that works on getting assets ready for us. I consult a lot with people like Matt Fraser, and some of our ambassadors on topics that I may not be most, kind of up to date with. So it really is a team effort. But for the most part, from the production side of it, it's just me doing the actual physical execution of LUMIX Live from right here. And then the second question was, you spotted an A10 Mini on the desk, but it wasn't in the setup description. I wonder if I use it. Yeah, so I've moved away from using the A10 Mini for a lot of the stuff that I've been doing recently, because I switched to the Elgato HD capture card, or the 4K capture card. But I still do use it when I want different camera angles. I have a camera mounted up on the ceiling for a top-down view. That's where the A10 will come in, but I've mostly transitioned over to using the Elgato stuff for the main transitions and the main kind of like camera capture for this. So that's enough with those questions for right now. Keep them coming. I will be addressing them over in the comment, or not in the comments, in the chat. But let's jump right into the actual meat of what today's stream is about, which is capturing content and working with our cameras at night. Now, to preface this, the recorded session, like I said, there are a lot of basic concepts in here. A lot of us have had experience filming at night or photographing at night, so some of this may be a little redundant and maybe a little basic, but we always have to start somewhere. So as we're going through this, if you have questions, you want me to clarify something that I said in that segment, drop it in the chat and we will address it live on air and also in the chat too. So let's jump over and talk to myself from last night.
One of the first things that you kind of look at is the location that you're going to be filming in, right? So this is an area in downtown where in the middle of the day, in the afternoon, around dusk, you're going to get a lot of, beautiful light when it comes to the city skyline behind me, even when you look the other direction towards, some of the event centers that's back there, and then the big open lawn that's behind us. And you'll always see situations like this where you're out, you're getting ready to finish the day, and you get that beautiful sunset behind you, the subjects that you're photographing or videoing, but then you have that, kind of perfect blue hour of the sun finally setting down. You're getting that gorgeous tone of blue in the sky. You get the city skylights start turning on, and you want to start playing with things like depth of field, to kind of really just add that extra pop. So Most of the time, when you're in an environment like this, you've got a couple things that you can rely on. So if you're a seasoned professional, some of these are going to be fairly basic. These are things that most of us that have been doing this for a while, we know, but you start looking around the environment. So right now, I'm only being illuminated by one of the street lamps that's down here. So when you start looking at the camera equipment and how we've designed our systems to work across the board, you've got a couple of really solid options there. Like I said, we're filming on the S5, but I've got my S1H here as well, which is another camera that we're going to talk about in a minute. And the reason why I like using these two cameras over something like, either a GH5S or even the GH6 currently at this point, is that we have the dual native ISO circuitry system set up in both of these cameras. So on the S5, that system is handled totally automatically. So when you just start raising your ISO into the different ranges, it's going to automatically change over the different circuitry for you. So you don't really have to think too much about it. And that's really what that system's designed for when it comes to the S5 platform. You know what you're doing, you want to have a lot of control over the camera, but you don't want to necessarily maybe have to remember to always jump in and change your native ISOs if you're trying to forcibly work in one over the other. But also for those that are not experienced enough, or you want to kind of just start to get yourself used to it, this system makes it where you just point the camera, set your ISO and go, and then the circuitry side of it's handled automatically. So right now, I'm shooting at 16,000 ISO. And I'm doing this to prove a point. One of the benefits of a lot of these modern cameras now, especially in the full frame series like with our S5 here, is that you're getting really, really good, clean looking high ISO. And if you needed to do any kind of noise reduction or post work with the files, there's enough software out there that can really give you solid results, as long as you've got a camera system that's capturing enough detail for that initial image. And the S5 is kind of perfect at that. There's no low pass filter. When you're shooting in 4K or you're shooting in 1080, you're getting a downsampled image, so the noise is going to be better to begin with anyway. It's got that dual native ISO circuitry, so it switches into the higher gain system. And those pieces combined are going to give you a much cleaner looking image. Now, one of the things you'll notice here is that I'm not, or you actually may not notice it, but I don't shoot at night in Vlog. And actually, for the most part, I don't shoot Vlog when it comes to creating any kind of these videos, or if I'm doing anything for training material that's being created. There's a huge benefit to shooting Vlog, obviously. If you're shooting and you have enough control of the light, or you've got enough ability to add light to a scenario, yeah, Vlog's going to be perfect. You can use that at night. There's going to be maybe a little more noise, but that's where understanding how to expose Vlog really kind of comes into play. But for most of this stuff, I just shoot in like 709. I know that I'm delivering directly for YouTube and kind of other online platforms. I don't need HDR for this kind of project. I don't need or want to have to go into post and do a lot of editing to this, so that I can just say that I did. These are more utilitarian, and that's one of the second things to kind of keep in mind when you're shooting at night is how much time do you have in post to work, and what kind of profile are you trying to go with. If you're in the middle of a project that's shooting Vlog or any other kind of log profile, yeah, obviously you're going to shoot in log, and you're going to grade it properly, you're going to expose properly, and that's where the tools come in that we have built into the camera to really kind of help you with that. But those tools can equally help you if you are shooting in 709 like I am. So, we covered kind of the basics. Everything that we talked about so far, most of you probably already know. And even if you're new to this, you probably still have a basic understanding of, make sure you understand the lighting that you're in, and make sure you kind of understand which camera you're working with. Well, one of the other things that you want to keep in mind at night is a lot of times we're used to shooting with things like 24 to 72 8s, 70 to 200 2.8s, 16 to 35 f4s, 2.8s, you name it. 2.8 is kind of the general walk around, general kind of workhorse lenses, and those have been the workhorse aperture lenses for years now, for decades. Well, now we're getting into an area where you've got some incredibly awesome prime lenses, and I know that I'm preaching to the choir with a lot of this, but the prime lenses are going to be one of your best friends when you're shooting at night. And for this scenario here, I'm shooting on the 24mm f1.8. So what that's allowing me to do is to just obviously set my aperture to f1.8. I get to have that benefit of having the greater light gathering capabilities of a fast aperture lens, but also I'm shooting wide enough that I don't have to worry as much about depth of field. And this is, what I would say is probably the third or maybe fourth point to bring up at night is primes are your friend when you're shooting like this. Yes, you can get faster lenses. If you're on the GH series, that's where like the 10 to 25 and the 25 to 50 are going to be your best friend. But in the full frame side, it's primarily going to be all of your fixed focus or your prime lenses. So why shoot it wider and why use a faster aperture, right? Well, when you work with the LUMIX cameras, you have a couple of different options available for you here. We've been talking a lot about how cameras like the S1H and cameras like even the S5 have much higher resolution capabilities than just 4K. So in our case, since we broadcast out in 1080p online, I can shoot this wider than I normally would in that higher resolution mode and then punch in post. The benefits there being is that when you tie that with the faster aperture lenses, that means that I can be shooting wide angle, so maybe not my normal field of view. I can throw guidelines onto the video framing here and take advantage of that really fast lens, because the wider angle you go, coupled with a faster aperture, you're not having that traditionally thought of depth of field. So I can be sitting here and I can move a little bit, not a lot, I can move a little bit and still be within focus. I don't have to necessarily always rely on autofocus for the systems. I don't really have to rely on stopping down because I want a more shallow depth of field look. You can see I can get a decent shallowish depth of field here, and you get a bit of the bokeh behind me. But that coupled with higher resolution means that I can be cropping in post. So aside from that, that's all hardware stuff. The lenses, that's kind of almost any brand out there. You're going to have fast aperture lenses, and if you're in with the LUMIX series, you've got the entire f1.8 series, and then there's going to be an 18mm coming out as well. So you've got a lot of fast lenses that are also wide to support you in a platform when you're shooting at night or even just in broad daylight. But the tools in the camera, the capabilities and the features that LUMIX are offering for this particular type, and really, this goes for normal shooting as well, normal daytime shooting, is that you've got higher resolution. You don't need 8K for necessarily shooting at ultra low light, because then you start also going into the challenge that ultra high resolution sensors may not have as clean higher ISO, so you got to do more work in post for noise reduction or downsampling, things like that. You work with a camera with us in those 6K areas, so 5.7K if you want to be shooting RAW or ProRes RAW or Blackmagic RAW, 5.8K if you're in the GH6, you've got 6K if you're on the S1H. You've got these options that allow you to record a much larger, higher resolution canvas that will give you much more flexibility in post for cutting noise down, for recropping out the framing, shooting wider so that you can capture it once and not have to necessarily do as many pickups. But that also means that I can be doing it like this and then do cut-ins and make it appear as though I've got more than one camera angle. And that all benefits you at night, especially when you're shooting, because it's one less thing you have to worry about. So Aside from that, there are also some other features too, and it's going to be a little more camera dependent from here on. So like we said, I'm shooting this on my S5. It's my workhorse camera. I use this for about 99% of the things that I'm shooting when it comes to video out in the field, and it is one of my more favorite photo cameras that we offer. And it's primarily because we've got live view composite in the camera, and we're going to talk about that too for photographers, you know, some of the benefits you've got. But the reason I brought my S1H out here is that the added benefits to, when it comes to the different S-series cameras that are out there, come down really into what you're doing with the camera and what environments, you know, you think you're going to be using the camera in. So we get asked often, you know, if an S1 and an S5 are so similar in features and capabilities. You know, both cameras can do RAW over HDMI, both cameras have a 24 megapixel sensor with no low pass filter, both have, you know, pretty much all the same functionality internally and externally. The difference being really just down to, you know, time limit recording, the S1 being a much larger camera. Well, there's other major benefits there too that can help you a lot if you're photographing and operating the camera in general at night. And one of those, which I'm going to be using my S1H here to show, is the fact that we built the cameras with back illuminated control buttons on the camera. So at night, I'm in a very darkish environment. You know, I do have some light, so I could either be doing that kind of move where, you know, you're moving the camera around, you're trying to see what the button is, what, you know, where it is, especially if you're just getting into a camera and you don't have that muscle memory built yet. We've built in with these cameras that when they're on, and I'll try to do this so you can see it a little bit easier. When they're on, you've got the options for, on the S1H and on the S1 and the S1R as well, you've got the top illuminated control panel here. So this one is what's going to give me all of my core exposure information, things like that. But also, if we look at the back of the camera, and I'll turn it this way so you can see it. When we look at the back of the camera, if I rotate the power switch around the shutter button, you'll see that it illuminates the rear main buttons on the camera. So that's going to give me my quick menu light up. That's also going to give me my back display, the trash button, as well as what I would say is most important next to the quick menu is the actual playback button up in the top here. So you get illuminated controls on the camera. A lot of times you don't realize how nice that is and how actually useful that is until you actually get out into an environment where you're fumbling around with a flashlight trying to look at the back of the camera and just kind of fiddle around with it until you get yourself so comfortable with the platform that you know just by feel where everything is. So that's one of the nice things that differentiates when you start going up into an S1, S1R, S1H over an S5. The S5, because it's smaller, you don't have backside illuminated buttons, so you would be a little bit more on that, try to get as comfortable with the button layout as you possibly can. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to go into my S1H and we're going to be looking at a slightly different scene here to actually go over the tools and what they look like when you're actually using them out in a lower light scenario. So with that, let's actually jump into my S1H's view and go from there. All right, so we've just changed over here. I've got my S1H hooked up and we're looking at the actual camera menu. So I've got it hooked up to my Video Assist 12G here, the Blackmagic device. And we're recording in ProRes so I can actually show you the camera menu and we can kind of get an idea of what I'm going to be changing here. So a couple of the tools, you can see one of them on the screen right now, and if I tap the screen and I move this around, you'll actually be able to see what this option does. So at night, being able to tell where your highlights are, where your deepest shadows are, can be very, very useful, especially if you're not going to be shooting in something like log. Well, maybe even equally if you're shooting in log, because you want to really make sure that you're kind of keeping within a good range. Well, this tool, it's that luminance spot meter tool, and we've talked about it ad nauseum, I believe, in a number of different events and different shows, right? So I've got my luminance spot meter hooked up here. So if I bring this, say, down onto my shirt, I'm able to look at this in the actual on-screen display, and I can tell that in Like 709, right now, this area of my shirt's only showing me about 3%, or what would be called 3 IRE. So depending on the broadcast area that you may be looking to be deploying this, that 3 to 2% like it's showing there is going to be below what's going to be clipped in the low range when you bring it into software and you bring it up into some sort of platform for delivery. So this allows me to look at that and make some of those decisions. Am I okay with my shirt basically being fully black? Is that something that I'm actually concerned about? Do I need to add some sort of fill light to bring that up over 7 or 10 IRE so that it doesn't go completely down into just black when I deploy this onto some of the different platforms? This also means that I'm able to come up here and say, I want to bring this up into the sky. Well, what's the sky going to be here? How is that going to look, color-wise? Is that going to be, well, right around a range that I want it to be? Am I going to have to be bringing the shadows up on this so that when I'm doing my edits, it ends up getting noisier because I want to lift the shadows? Or am I overexposing enough that I can actually be bringing that level down so that it actually edits fine, right? These are some of the things that you want to kind of keep in mind, and the Lumix products give you these tools. Now, yes, you have waveform, you've got vector scope, and waveform will show up on the camera. I can't output that over the HDMI with the way our system's designed. So if you're not working with a monitor, waveform is going to be a really solid option to take a look at that as well. But luminance spot meter at night, even if you're not using it necessarily to determine where middle gray is or where your skin tones are, is a good tool to show you where your actual shadows and highlights are going to be. We know that over my shoulder, over this shoulder, that highlight is going to be completely blown out. That's just a given in this kind of scenario. But I want to make sure that my sky isn't, too far down into the shadows or buried way too far down. Now, right here for this type of shooting, I'm not going out to make any kind of masterpiece of a film. This is fine for YouTube. I'm still shooting at that 16,000 ISO. I'm at f1.8, so I'm wide open, and I'm at a 180-degree angle because I'm shooting this at 60p. So one thing I can do is I can lower the frame rate, go down to like 30p or 60p, and that would also help because I'd be able to then get more light per frame. So that's one benefit you can do at night. So this gives me a basic platform to kind of work with. The other thing that this allows me to do too is I know that, roughly I want my midtones, around 42 IRE. I want to be as close to where the skin tones are going to look about right. You're not going to really have to worry too much about pushing and pulling that exposure in post. This can help you with that as well, because I can drag that luminance spot meter, put it right on my skin and see, well, my skin's about 30-ish IRE, so I'm underexposed. I'm definitely underexposed. But how much of that is okay for this platform? Again, I stress that what I'm doing with these videos, the way I'm trying to get this across to everyone, is that if you are just getting into this, knowing the platform that you're going to be delivering the content on can be beneficial for how you want to work with this footage. If you're going to be shooting in log, you want to make sure you take that into account. You want to make sure that you understand how to capture log in low light so that you minimize noise, which is pretty much always going to be overexpose it as much as you can while maintaining the brightest highlight point that you want to keep without necessarily running your ISO up as high as you possibly can. So keep some of that in mind. The other tool that we offer in a lot of the cameras that will help in a lot of scenarios when you're shooting and filming at night is going to be the fact that we have the night mode built into the camera. Now, again, I can only show you the menu operation for this, but I have it programmed to one of my function buttons on the back of the camera. This allows me to come in here and actually go in and turn my monitor to be the night mode, and also turn my live view finder to be in night mode. What this does is this gives me a red display on the camera. So if I'm shooting out and say I don't have much of these lights, if I'm going out and I'm trying to film, say, the Milky Way or a time lapse of something like that, you want to make sure that your eyesight isn't necessarily being thrown off by what the camera is doing for you. Because the camera displays are going to be very bright. They're filled with a lot of, blue light that comes off it. So the red light's going to help you acclimate to lower light shooting. When using cameras like the S1H, if you're strictly into filmmaking, that can be distracting. So one of the other things that you do always have with our cameras is if I go right here into the menu and then I go down into my custom wrench, you'll see, it's the regular wrench. You'll see that I do have the ability to come over here and also set the monitor backlight, so I can come in and adjust this to the different levels that work easiest for me out in the field. One thing to note is when you're filming at night with any of the LUMIX cameras, by default your camera is going to have this set to auto. I highly recommend when you are filming or photographing or doing anything with these cameras, especially at night, make sure that you come in here and you set it to one of the kind of static options that's available. I usually just set it to 0 because that's what allows me to just know that when I'm looking at the exposure on the camera, which you really shouldn't use the rear LCD of any of these cameras to judge exposure. It's not the best way to actually determine whether or not you've got a shot exposed or not. You want to look at the tools that you have available. By setting the LCD screen to be a set brightness, you don't worry about like when cars pass by that the sensor picks up that it's bright, so then it dims the screen, or it gets really dark out so it really over brightens the rear display. It's a little thing that's going to help you in the long run in making sure that if you are doing it visually, you're not going to have to worry too much about kind of shifting exposures. It's going to look closer to correct. So the next thing to kind of look at here as far as tools go and what I can show you on the back of this camera is that we have also the constant preview options available in different LUMIX cameras. Traditionally, constant preview we know has been not necessarily one of the best things to use for photographers and videographers if you're shooting it at slower shutter angles or slower shutter speeds. Well, that kind of exacerbates at night. If you're going out for photography and you want to be able to kind of use the camera and still judge some of your exposure, the S5, the S1H, they have the ability to decouple the shutter speed functionality from your constant preview system. And the way you can do that is if I go onto the back of this camera, I'm going to press and hold one of the directional pads here. This is now bringing up my kind of quick access into what I want that button to be programmed as. Well, if I scroll through this menu, you'll see as I'm going through this list, you're going to come across the preview aperture effect, and then constant preview. This is the choice that you would be using if you want to just be able to tell, what's the aperture going to look like, what's the bokeh going to look like as I'm changing my exposures. So I would come up in here, set this particular button to be the preview aperture effect, and then when I turn that on, when I'm getting ready for my shot, I'll be able to actually have the aperture step down to show me what that bokeh is going to look like. I can then determine, okay, am I on the right lens? What aperture do I want to shoot at? Do I have enough light to shoot at that? So it's another tool to help you, kind of judge what your exposure is going to be. So now, one of the other things to kind of take a look at is on the actual display that you're seeing on the screen here is that right below me is your exposure meter. That's going to give you a general kind of point of what your exposure is set at. Now, if you're out shooting video, most of the time, like I said earlier, you want to try to make sure that this is as overexposed as you can while still maintaining your highlights and keeping your midtones about where they should be. But that isn't always going to be possible, especially if you're filming or photographing where you don't have additional lights with you to kind of aid in that style of shooting. So You can use this to kind of keep a rough idea of what the scene's exposure is being picked up as. Because I use center weighted metering, it's going to use about this region of the actual frame, so everything that's between my hands, to give me a rough idea of where that exposure is. And that kind of roughly shows when you look at the luminance spot meter kind of bouncing around. It's close, it's a decent reference point. You do want to try to keep that as close to zero as you can when you're filming at night or when you're photographing at night. But photographing is also another area where you don't necessarily trust that or utilize that when you're actually going to go out to capture, say, like the stars, or do something like live view composite, which we're going to demo in a moment. So I know this is a lot of kind of varying different things to kind of keep an eye on, but with our cameras, like I said, you have all of these different tools. You've got that luminance spot meter, which you can see. You've got the tools like waveform, which we've shown in previous videos on the GH6, which is going to be the same on the S1H, same on the S5. You've got those tools at your disposal. All right, so let's recap some of the kind of highlight things that Lumix offers you when you're filming at night, right? So we've got night mode. That mode for photographers that allows you to get out there, be able to utilize your camera, be able to see what's on the screen without imparting any kind of negative effect on your vision when you're shooting at night. It means that you won't be blinded to what's around you. Big benefit, we're one of the only cameras out there that's adding it in there. You've also got the option in cameras like the S1, the S1R, and the S1H of having a camera that has backside illuminated or back illuminated buttons available for it. So if you're not really 100% comfortable with how your camera operates at night, you don't necessarily know and by feel where all those buttons are, you've got right on the product the ability to see those buttons illuminated and know where the core ones are. Things like your quick menu, your playback, the trash can, the display button, and even the back button. They also have the top LCDs, which is going to give you a really quick way to view what your camera settings are, whether you're on an S1H, an S1R, or even on an S1. And then actually even on a G9 as well, if you've got one of those. You've also got the ability and the benefit of our entire f1.8 series lenses for the L mounts, so the S cameras. Those lenses, when coupled with things like our ability to capture video in open gate, in 6K when you're talking on the full frame camera, in 5K if you're looking at the S1R and you are using that as a video camera, you've got options to be able to film in these very wide, high resolution aspect ratios so that you can be cropping in later. That benefits you when you're filming at night by being able to use wider angle lenses at faster apertures and not have to necessarily fight so much with shallow depth of field where you're razor thin because of the actual field of view that you're working with. You could be shooting on something like a 24mm at f1.8 at a moderate distance and still have enough depth of field to move a little bit if you're using manual focus and not have to tax the systems as hard when you're working at night if you do choose to use autofocus. Lastly, you also have the ability to use the tools like waveform, like luminance spot meter, to be able to help judge your exposures when you're looking at things like the sky, the highlights of the buildings behind me, and even the skin tones. These are all things that are just normal place on the Lumix cameras. So you have these tools, use them. They're gonna help you create much better content when you're out in the field. Whether you're shooting in Vlog or you're shooting in Like 709 like I do, these will just make things so much easier and so much more enjoyable to get out and shoot. And ultimately, with the video side, don't necessarily worry so much about things like noise or scrubbing it to be the cleanest looking possible footage out there. Story and content is definitely a very important thing. Whether you're doing something like a training video or you're just going out creating a fun video because that's what you enjoy to do. Content is king. We all know that story and things like that are. The cameras are designed to kind of help you with that. When you work with the Lumix cameras, you don't really need to worry too much about filming in low light. We've got the dual native architecture for our sensor design in full frame. That means that you can comfortably be shooting at higher ISOs, depending on the color profile that you're working in, and not really have to worry too much about how much noise is going to be in the image. The side benefit here too is that when you're working in post, there are a ton of softwares out there now that can help clean up noise from higher ISO video footage. So it's really just not something as much that you really need to worry too much about. So with that, we're going to go back to the studio and we're going to continue this topic more, and we'll hand it back over to Live Me.
So, there's with pretty much everything that we talked about in the recorded sessions, you can see there's a lot of basics that were kind of covered, and a lot of the questions that actually came up through that section I want to kind of dive in a little bit more with. So one of the questions that actually just came up was kind of clarifying my statement about using vlog and shooting at night. So depending on how you're kind of setting up to shoot, right? That's where you would kind of have to determine whether or not log is going to give you the benefits that you need at night versus shooting in some sort of pre-baked in 709 style profile. So when I had mentioned that, working with these kinds of videos, that I don't shoot log for the vast majority of the things that I shoot, if ever, that's more about the type of content that I'm creating, the type of video creation that we're doing. I don't need log for these outputs. As you can see, whenever you're doing a live broadcast, you have a lot of other things that you need to kind of keep in mind with. You can grade a project to be perfect when you want to actually post it onto a platform. So like YouTube, Vimeo, actually have it displayed on a television, and you're going to actually have that quality show through because it's going to be using the bitrate that you created that video at. When you're doing a live broadcast, you're typically working in either a constant bitrate, which is going to be relatively low, or you're working in a variable bit rate, which is being sent up into the platform. As an example, you have cameras that can record at 150 megabit per second or 400 megabit per second. Or if you're on something like the GH6, you've got up to 800 megabit per second internally for our internal codecs. Well, when you do a YouTube live stream like this, particularly this instance here, YouTube only recommends anywhere between 6 to 9 megabit per second. So your quality actually ends up really never coming across if you're doing it in this particular method. That's different from actually shooting a video and uploading it as an actual video product on a page. So when I'm looking at this, for these types of streams, there's no point in me shooting log, going through the process of grading it, bringing it back into a 709 profile if I'm going to be broadcasting it in a 709 platform that's going to have its own platform degradation of that content. So my whole point there is look at how you're going to be delivering your content. Do you need to shoot it in that particular way? And especially if I'm shooting at night, I really don't need to have to be shooting in vlog for this purpose because most of that quality is going to be lost. I don't need the extra workload for this project. At night, yes, you get more dynamic range when you shoot in a log profile, but you also have to take into consideration that you're probably going to have to bring more lights. Most cameras have log profiles that are also going to be at a higher ISO, so that kind of offsets a bit. But in a scenario like that, where the point was to shoot it without using external lighting sources to kind of try to bring that point home for this, it just adds a lot of extra, kind of headache to a process that isn't really needed. If you're someone that goes out there and you love shooting in log profiles at night, awesome, more power to you. That's a skill and color grading and matching and things like that. That is definitely a skill that if you know how to do it and you have a workflow that is easy for you, awesome. Flaunt it, use it, and show it off to everybody. But for a lot of us, like 709, Cine-like profiles, the natural profile, whichever one you tend to prefer best is the one that's going to be the best choice for you. One of the comments here, Epic was saying, is there a huge difference in Cine-like V and like 709? And To a point there is. Cinelike V is a profile that's going to be designed to be that cinematic tonality, but also have more contrast and be more vivid in its actual colors. So it's not really, less saturated, that kind of thing. The Like 709 profile is specifically designed so that it tries to keep as much of the color gamut and the exposure within the Like 709 color space. So when you are directly putting it into a 709 platform, you really know what you're going to get. You don't really have to worry about colors being outside of 709 as much. And you kind of know where your highlights are going to clip. You can adjust the highlights a bit with the profiles that are built into the camera. So it's worth playing with. For some people, it's going to be awesome. For others, it may be just too dull or too kind of simplified for a lot of their work. One of the other questions that came up actually was also about the kind of exposures and focal lengths, because I talk about using a wider angle lens with a faster aperture at night to kind of balance my exposures out because I can shoot at higher resolutions. Well, there are a couple things to keep in mind when you're working with faster aperture lenses or wider angle lenses and the way they interact with your camera. So I believe it was FC that brought the question up, which was the original question has to do with the inverse square law and the way light actually falls off, and then, kind of how do you judge your exposure there? Well, some of this kind of flies a bit in the face of the way camera meters work. Your camera meter in any of your cameras, I don't care what brand it's from, who's making it, a light meter is designed very specifically to do one thing, and that is to average lighting out to middle gray. That's what it's using to judge what a proper exposure is going to be. You can alter this with your cameras these days. Now, in the Lumix cameras, you have 4 different metering modes available to you. In the newer cameras, some other cameras, you may only have 3. And that's going to be the multi-metering, which is the full area. Center weighted, which is a more centralized, just as the name says, it's center weighted. Then you'll also have usually a spot meter or a kind of flexible spot meter, which in our case, you have 2 ways to use it. It's either dead center in the camera, or you can map it so that when you move the focus point, that's where your spot meter is. And all of those have an impact on how the camera's meter is representing that information back to you. So in the second part of the segment where I was pointing out the light meter that's always right at the bottom of the camera, that's only telling you what the metering mode is designed to show. Metering modes can be very easily tricked in the kind of scenario that you're shooting in. At night, you tend to notice it more heavily than general kind of average everyday kind of filming or photographing. And what I mean by that is that scene that you saw, there were incredibly bright highlights in the bokeh, and there were really, really dark shadows in my shirt and the background. Well, the light meter is trying to tell you where you need to balance that exposure so that everything kind of falls in middle gray as far as luminance goes. And when you do that, you end up with really heavily blown out highlights and really crushed down shadows if you are to kind of use that at 0, because it's trying to find that kind of balance point. The heavier your scene is swayed towards really bright or really dark, the more the opposite side of the exposure is going to kind of falter in that sense. So at night, that's why using things like waveform, using even a histogram can help in this. But most importantly with our cameras, using things like luminance spot meter are going to help you get that ideal exposure that you're looking for. If you end up working with those and judging everything just off what your meter tells you, you will have widely different exposure values depending on how you've got it set up, but also depending on the position that you've got the camera in. So yes, they're good for reference, but you want to kind of keep that in mind especially at night, because you exacerbate the issue. The other area where you may have noticed this just in passing is, say it's snowing out and you go outside to photograph and you want really white snow. Well, the meter's not going to let you get white snow if you use the meter as its default out from the cameras. It's going to try to balance that out and bring those highlights in and bring the exposure down, so snow tends to turn gray. So you end up having to overexpose your shot for snow or for anything that's really white. Wedding photographers and videographers, you probably run into this all the time. A white wedding dress doesn't look white if you just use the built-in meter. That's where your tools come in, because you can go in and say, well, I don't want that white being close to 42. I want that closer to, like, 80% on zebras or something. You want it right before it clips because you want it to be that vibrant brightness that it is, which has the added benefit of your shadows are going to be brighter so that you can bring them down in post instead of having to bring them up in post if you were to just use the basic meter built into the camera. The other side part of that is also when it comes to your lens selections at night. Looking at two lenses, say I look at my 20-60 and then the 50mm f 1.8. The two of these lenses, if you were to set this at 5.6 and this at 5.6 at long telephoto lens, and you're using the in-camera's meter, you may be getting a slightly different exposure between the two cameras. Usually, it's not going to be anything that's going to be a major difference between the two appearances of the image. But your exposure meter selection will have an impact on that. If you take an ultra wide angle shot and you use multimetering, the metering system's using a much broader area to judge what that exposure should be versus the tighter crop that lens is causing, because you're zooming into a point. The meter is going to be judging just on what that information is. So it's one of the reasons why I use center weighted a lot of times, is because it isolates the area that I'm using more. So if I'm jumping between an ultra wide telephoto and a more, or an ultra wide lens and a more telephoto lens, I'm not going to see as big of a shift there. Spot metering is going to give you probably one of the best ways to do this, but you do have to be careful with spot metering, because if you put it on black, it's going to take black and bring it to gray. The third thing to just kind of keep in mind is that typically primes have better light transmission than zoom lenses. This is what Andy was commenting in the thread about this, or Alan was commenting on this. There are two different values that can be read for light transmission, or what an aperture is on a camera. The aperture value, or the f-stop value, is a mathematical equation of the element to the opening in the iris. That's what's giving you your f-stop. The t-stops is actually how much light is actually coming through the lens. Very, very high-end lenses like our 51.4, the S Pro lens, and many, many higher-end cinema lenses will typically have a very good light transmission, which means it's going to be closer to the F value, if not exactly the F value. And that value means that it's passing, that's the actual light that's going in through the sensor. F-stop value in lower, less expensive lenses, really, kind of the nifty 50s of the world, they're typically a bigger delta between your f-stop and your actual T value. But modern lenses have also gotten really, or modern optical formulas have also gotten really good at maintaining light transmission, even compared to the f-stop. So it's not as big of a thing to kind of think about these days anymore. But if you've looked at cinema lenses versus an actual kind of photographic lens, and I think there are some good examples from Sigma that they have a cine-housed version and a kind of photo-housed version. The cine lenses typically will always be rated in T-stops, not in f-stops, because transmission is what you want if you're trying to match exposures. So let's take a look here. There were a couple more comments and questions that came through, so hopefully that addressed some of those other questions there. Let's see here. Applaud using 180 degree at night for relative slow motion frame. Yeah, it's another one of those areas where you don't necessarily need to keep to the 180 degree rule. I typically tend to always stick to 180 degree. That's another trick you can use if you don't have a lot of motion. You're not worried about staccato effect. You can always work on using either a longer shutter duration or a longer shutter speed to let more light in. But you do have to remember that you will get some more motion blur if your subject does move. Or if you're really bright, you can use a faster shutter angle or a faster shutter speed, but you're going to get a little bit more of a staccato look to that footage. Can be used very creatively as well, too. Let's see here. Where was the question here? Super Zero would like to know that too. GH5 has Cinelike D2 and V2. Yeah, so a little bit of a difference between the variants. Cine D2 and V2 are just the more modern variants of Cine-like profiles. They're designed to match closer if you're using one of the S-series cameras or even like a Vericam, and you want to match your Cine-like profiles or even the EVA. If you want to match your Cine-like profiles, that's why you end up seeing like V2 in some of those with the other cameras that are out there. Let's see here. Some of the other questions. What was it? Damon says, I was under the impression Cinelike D was intended for post-processing and Cinelike V is more out-of-camera content, but I could be misremembering. Not necessarily. I think a lot of people that have been working with the cameras like the base that you get with Cinelike D. It is a more desaturated cinematic style, photo style for all intent and purpose, whatever you want to consider cinematic to be. So a lot of people will use Cine D as a base and then grade upon that. Not necessarily designed as a grading color profile. They are designed to be closer to a finished product. If you want full benefits of grading, that's where you go to Vlog. Cinelike V is a much closer to finished cinematic style color profile. You can grade both of them. You can grade any color profile in a camera. It's just a matter of how much latitude you're going to have in post with it. So you're not really misremembering it all on that one. Cinelike D definitely is used often for grading in post, but not to the same level that Vlog is, and even to a lesser extent, Cinelike V is really rarely ever graded because of how contrasty and vibrant it already is. Let's see here. Jeremy says, I have a hard time with skin tones in Like 709 for live streaming. I just made a LUT for OBS and always use Vlog with different versions of the LUT for 0 to 1.5 stops overexposed. Yeah, so with all of our cameras, that's one of the nice things with it, is that you have all of this flexibility. Like 709 tends to be very particular in making sure your white balance mix is also correct. Wanting to make sure that, say like I have these lights set up to 6,000 Kelvin, but they're not really 6,000 Kelvin. There is a bit of a tint to them. So having to go in there with a gray card and actually try to kind of fine tune some of the adjustments. You do have that adjustment when you are working with any of our custom white balances or in the Kelvin area. So you can adjust your tint a bit, which can majorly help in making sure that your white balance, your skin tones look pretty accurate. But yeah, using Vlog and outputting over HDMI as a LUT is another very valid way to do that. Makes things relatively pretty easy. Let's see here. Michael says, any plans for an EVA 2 with L-mount? At the moment, I'm a bit on the fence, investing more in L-mount. Unfortunately, I don't have any information on the EVA products. That is our Vericam and our Cinema Broadcast group. So I just don't have any info that I'd be able to provide. Probably the best thing I can say is that the L-mount is alive and strong. Remember that you've got, Leica, Sigma, Panasonic, DJI, and Lights are all members of the L-mount Alliance, developing products and cameras and lenses and all that kind of fun stuff. So there's a lot of cool stuff to be excited with the L-mount. I wouldn't necessarily be worried about investing money in this mount. Let's see here. FC says, when shooting videos at night with video steady lights, what ISO to use? If I shoot lower ISO, then video lights increase and cause subject to squint. Another good point about shooting at night. There's a balance that you kind of have to figure out, I think, for any particular style of shooting that you're going to do, or any type of night filming or photo that you want to figure out. Big, heavy, bright lights, yes, they will cause your subjects to not necessarily look as natural. Biggest tip I usually have with that is if you do need to add lights at night, go for a large diffused source that you can. Anything that's as big and diffused as you possibly can. Even these are going to cause a very hard directional light because this is not a lot of diffusion with it. This is where bringing the light further back and bringing the intensity up can definitely help. You experience this if you look at a street light from a distance, and then as you get closer, you start to squint more because the intensity is brighter. If you do need to bring in really bright, big lighting, move them far away and bring the brightness up, the intensity to kind of help with that, or bring them close and use something that's really diffused, and that can definitely help there. Let's see here. Raven says, pushing it up, can you please explain exposure compensation on the GH6 in creative video mode with ISO on auto? It doesn't seem to do anything. So exposure compensation, if you have anything set to auto in a camera, exposure compensation isn't going to do what you think it's going to do. Technically, yes, exposure compensation should allow you to say, I want this image to be a stop brighter, or I want this overall, image to be brighter or darker. If you use exposure compensation with an auto ISO, you're adding in a number of variables into the way the cameras work. So exposure compensation, when you have auto ISO, in a lot of cases can actually just tell the camera, well, lower the ISO or raise the ISO because you're within a range. If you're trying to use exposure compensation because you want a brighter or darker image, one of the things that you can actually use in its place instead is actually changing the meter offset in the camera. That'll let you say, like, if I'm using center weighted metering for this particular shoot, and I'm always running into the point that I feel that the images are underexposed, well, I can go in there and say, well, center weighted metering, I want to always have a bias to be +1 or +2 stops EV, and that will reset what 0 is on the meter. Otherwise, anytime you add an auto capability in the exposure triangle, you're making it infinitely more complicated for the system to figure out what do you mean by exposure compensation in that sense. Because technically you're also compensating with exposure if you are in auto ISO and then you tell it -1. So if the camera was going to choose 1600 ISO, now it's going to choose 800 ISO, and adjust it that way. If you're in full manual and you've got auto ISO, I believe only a couple of cameras allow you to use exposure compensation. So it's kind of hit or miss. I usually never recommend using any kind of exposure compensation unless you've got a set ISO in the cameras, because it opens up too many variables that you don't really have control over, and in a lot of cases you may run into situations like you're saying that it doesn't appear to really be doing anything, because it is, but it's not doing what you're expecting it to do. So let's see here. We've got time for one more question. Is there any platform to work with content creators or a way to reach Lumix? Tags and hashtags don't do it. So there are ways. We are, with this platform, this is one of the areas where if you're active and you're interacting with us in the LUMIX Live platforms, we see that, and our team is constantly looking for people to work with and, kind of engage with on content creation and stuff like that. Ultimately, it really just comes down to your content that's being put online being something that either matches with something we're looking for at any given time, and those kinds of concepts are always fluid, so I couldn't give you one clear answer for that. The other way is, constantly just be someone in the different social platforms, whether you're Instagram, Facebook, Reddit, YouTube here. That's kind of promoting yourself. And if you happen to be using the Lumix cameras and you're talking about it, that's going to draw the sight of our marketing team and the content creation teams to kind of see like, hey, this person could be cool to work on with a project if we have something come up. So direct work with it usually will reach out to somebody if the content kind of catches our eye. And from my perspective, because I do work with that team often, if you're active on here, you're on my radar of things that come up and say, hey, you know, I remember, you know, so-and-so in Lumix Live was talking about this project that they worked on, or, you know, this content. And that will actually make it easier in my head when I start, you know, working on projects with the team to recommend people and say, hey, you know, this user out in the audience has been doing some cool stuff. Maybe we should take a look and have our agencies work with them. So, but that also brings up a good point. If you've got content that you're like really proud of, or you've got, you know, channels that you're really proud of, let us know those things. Drop them in the chat, drop them in the comments after this video, because we're always looking for, you know, people that are out there that are creating content with Lumix. It's one of the more fun things to see the cool stuff that you guys create with all these cameras, as opposed to necessarily the stuff that I work on every day with our teams. And if we're going to ever broaden out and try new styles of content in ads and stuff like that, the stuff that all of you create is what kind of helps us direct, you know, who do we work on with projects. So feel free to always drop your social tags, things like that, in these chats, in the comments afterwards, because we see them. And who knows, maybe there may be something that you know, we do want to do something with you in the future. So with that, we are at time for this week's stream. Make sure I'm not missing anything else in here. Cool. So yes, thank you all so much this week. This was a fun topic. And obviously, as I said, with the recorded part of it, it was a very basic level kind of introduction into, you know, some of the things to pay attention to if you're working at night. There are a ton more things, and I'm sure everyone that's in the chat, if you've got experience filming at night, you know that there are things that I've missed or things that I kind of glossed over in some of those sections. But we will be back next Thursday at 2 p.m. We are working on getting a couple of streams in a row with some guests to come on. So I'm in the final processes of getting that stuff kind of solidified and some of the sessions set up. We've got some time differences with people, so they're going to be some mix of recorded and actually having people live on the broadcast. So make sure to tune into those next week, next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. If you have recommendations for future streams that you want us to cover, you can either drop them in the chat, drop them in the comments after the video is posted, or you can shoot us an email to lumixlive@us.panasonic.com, and we can work on if those topics are big enough for us to actually do an entire stream about, or if we put a bunch of them into a single broadcast. Outside of that, again, thanks everybody. I hope you all have a great rest of your weekend. If you shoot some cool stuff or you film some cool stuff, let us know. Tag us online with it. Drop your social accounts in the chat as well, or in the comments. And yeah, look forward to seeing what everybody creates and coming back to you live next Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. With that, take care. Talk to you next week.